It is the Lord. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
The mother of Jesus and his brothers arrived at the house, and standing outside, they sent word to Jesus and called him. Crowds seated around him told him, "Your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you." But he said to them in reply, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking around at those seated in the circle, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So we continue reading through the second book of Samuel, and as I've been reminding you, right, the timeline of the Old Testament is basically after the people of Israel were freed from Egypt, they wandered through the desert for 40 years, and then they entered the Promised Land. And it took a couple of centuries for them to actually conquer the whole Promised Land, right, and fulfill God's promise. And eventually, under the time of King David, right, he established the capital city in Jerusalem, right? And that was basically considered the fulfillment of God's promise. His covenant, his kingdom was established. We'll read about that ceremony tomorrow. Something that I think is interesting about this, and it's good for us to be aware of, when I was at Seek a couple of weeks ago, we were talking to Wabash students about some of their religion classes at Wabash. And one of the guys was talking about something called the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis is the idea that the first 5 books of the Bible were not written by Moses, which of course is the traditional teaching among Christians and Jews. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the books of Moses. Now, some of you might even be surprised to hear that, because maybe you haven't heard that. It's because in academia, this documentary hypothesis has taken over. And so that trickles down through universities and through seminaries and into sermons and homilies and Bible studies. And so most people don't know, right, that the first 5 books of the Bible are called the books of Moses. Jesus in the Gospels, when he told the Pharisees and Sadducees that Moses had written of him, he was talking about those first 5 books, which we call the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible. I was talking with these Wabash students about this, and one of the guys was talking about how he believed in the documentary hypothesis. And there's multiple reasons why people will say, they believe in this. The main reason is because there's parts of the first 5 books of the Bible which seem to indicate 2 different authors. Like maybe in the book of Genesis, you basically have 2 creation stories, or at least that's what many scholars say. It's not exactly, a universal interpretation. Other reason why people will say things about this is because sometimes Moses, there are things said about him which he obviously couldn't have said. Like when Deuteronomy talks about how Moses died. Right? Presumably Moses didn't write that. Or when Moses said, or when the book of Deuteronomy says that Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. It doesn't seem like Moses would say that. What Catholics, what Christians and Jews have always believed is that Moses was the primary author, and the way that we explain some of those other parts is that eventually there was somebody who was also editing to include necessary information that Moses obviously did not say. So Moses was still the primary author, and then there was an editor. Now, the reason why I'm bringing all this up is because one of the main arguments for the traditional Christian understanding of Moses writing the first 5 books of the Bible is because if I asked you, what is the most famous city of the Old Testament? The most famous city of the Old Testament. What would you say? You'd say Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem is where the capital was set up. It's where the temple was built. It's where basically the people of God, right? It was their headquarters, Jerusalem, all throughout the Old Testament. And what's interesting about the first 5 books of the Bible is that nowhere, not in a single place, is the city of Jerusalem mentioned. Not in a single place. And so the argument you would say is that if those first 5 books of the Bible were written later on, after Moses, presumably the person writing would have talked more about Jerusalem to explain why Jerusalem became such a big deal later on in the Old Testament. It's one of the most powerful arguments you can give against that documentary hypothesis. Now, however, there is one exception, and this is what relates to the reading from this morning, is that even though Jerusalem is not mentioned by name in those first 5 books, the city of Jerusalem is alluded to on a few occasions. When Melchizedek, the king and priest who offered the thanksgiving offering of bread and wine, says that he is the king of Salem. Psalm 76 says that Salem is the same place as Jerusalem. Likewise, when David established Jerusalem as the capital city and when Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, Chronicles says that this is the place where Isaac had been sacrificed. Mount Moriah. So Jerusalem is basically, even though it wasn't called Jerusalem early on, it is the same location as where Melchizedek was the king, and where Isaac had been almost sacrificed. So it has this significance, and that's why it takes on such a vital importance throughout the rest of the Bible, because those 2 key Old Testament events took place there, and perhaps it was even where the Garden of Eden was. That explains why in the passage we read this morning that David, King David, who is not a Levite, who is not a Levitical priest, when the Ark of the Covenant was brought into Jerusalem, he was the one who put on the linen apron, which is a really bad English translation. Right? But that was the priestly garment. Right? It wasn't like some cooking apron or something like that. Right? He was wearing a priestly vestment. It says that he sacrificed an oxen and a fatling. Right? Again, that was things that priests would do. David was the one who danced before the Ark of the Lord as it came in. Again, that was something the priests would do. And yet here David did it, because he is a king and a priest taking up the throne of the ancient king-priest Melchizedek. So it's really fascinating when you can see these different connections between these different events in the Old Testament, right, and how they fit together, and why David acted the way that he did. Something else for us, just as a closing thought for us, is that this is very significant that when David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem to set up the capital city, he danced before the Lord with abandon. And as you read later on in the chapter, his wife actually despised him for his dancing with reckless abandon. In other words, sometimes when we give reckless praise to God, we will be looked upon with scorn, sometimes by family members or friends or coworkers, especially if we give ourselves completely to God. Some people might wonder why all of you, right, you make the point to come every single morning to Mass, or why you drive when it's a severe weather warning. Some people might wonder why you give some of your finances to the church. Some people might wonder why you give so much of your time to the church. Sometimes people will look upon us with scorn. But it's important that we give ourselves to God recklessly, with abandon. And that when God comes to us, just as the ark came to David, the only really fitting response is that response. That every time when God comes to us in the Holy Eucharist, for example, in communion, we should be so overwhelmed with gratitude that we can't help but be overflowing with joy that God has come to us. Too often we take it for granted, God's presence among us, and how amazing it is that He gives Himself to us. The only fitting response is reckless praise and gratitude for God coming to us.